We made this.
Welcome to Bigger Disc. I am your host, Matt Latham, and this is the podcast where someone picks a disc to talk about for whatever reason I want to. And today I'm welcoming on Rob Kassees from the 1001 Albums Complaints podcast to talk about Flood by TheyMightBeGiants.com. So if you've listened to this for the last 116 episodes beforehand, the drill. We talk about the songs, talk about the blah, talk. You know what we're talking about. We talk about the album. We also talk about some nice kind of slight deviations. We talk about the Tiny Toon Adventures cartoon for a very brief moment in time. Which I love that cartoon, and I can't wait for you to listen to the conversation that we have. But before you listen to that, then I'm just going to shill the little podcasty things that we've got related to this. So we've got the Twitter account, the Instagram account, the Facebook page, which I don't really do. All it does, I think, is just post what's on the Instagram account. But we're on Facebook anyway, under Pick a Disc. And as always, there's the link to the Discord server in the show notes. If you want to come in, say hello, tell us what you're listening to, tell us who you've seen live, and, just say hello. I really would like to hear from you if you listen to the podcast and pop into the Discord. So, that's it for me. I'm going to back away, let past me do the interview, and speak to Rob. I'm going to just make the case for if it sounds even worse than usual, and it's not just because of my hosting. I'm currently holding my new microphone because my microphone arm broke. I've currently got about every window possible open in my house, so if you suddenly hear cars, trains, neighbours suddenly be picked up on the mic, I apologise, but pretty much my mic arm broke 3 seconds in, so I'm going to make that excuse now. It's not about me, of course. It's the podcast is about the guests and the albums they bring. So I've got Rob Kassees with me from the 1001 Album Complaints podcast to here to talk about an album. How you doing, Rob?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
I don't know what the weather's like in LA at the moment, but over here in the UK, and on time recording, we're currently going through a heat wave, and notoriously, Britain, like the British stereotype about moaning about the weather, is completely true. I'm currently sweating. We do not have AC at all. So
oh, bummer. We do have AC where I'm at. It is definitely summer, quite sunny, kind of dry climate. I'm in Northern California.
So probably about the same temperature as the centre of England at the moment. So the way we
perhaps going. So.
We're not here, as always, we're not here to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about music and an album that Rob has brought. So, Rob, why don't you tell the lovely listeners the disc that you've picked for us to talk about today?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I have picked They Might Be Giants' 1990 album, Flood. Very excited to get into talking about that one.
So, why did you pick Flood?
It has quite a bit of personal significance for me. It's meaningful to my personal musical journey. I've now been playing music myself and producing records and, of course, doing the 1001 Album Complaints podcast for a long time. And this brings me back to when I was a really young kid, and They Might Be Giants were really the first band that felt like my band. It felt like I had discovered them. That wasn't exactly true, and we can get into it. But it was a shift. People who love music, they love the discovery of music. They love the crate diving aspect. They love finding something that feels like it's theirs. Mm-hmm. They Might Be Giants, Flood, and that was my entry point to They Might Be Giants, who became a great love of mine when I was very young, was my first band like that it felt like they were just mine because they didn't have hit songs on the radio, etc.
Okay. So how old were you then, if you don't mind me asking, when you first heard them?
Well, when this came out, I was 10, but I believe I was 11 when I first heard this. So it bounced around just a bit. And interestingly enough, I heard them first on a cartoon show that I watched after school.
Was it Tiny Toon Adventures?
Yes, it was.
We'll have to talk about that in a second because I think we've got similar.
So that's how it first got to me. Yeah, they made little music videos via Tiny Toons, which was sort of a Bugs Bunny, like it was like what Muppet Babies is to Muppets, this was to Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, for those who might not remember. And it was popular. They played it after the school day ended where I was growing up, and so I would watch it consistently. And they didn't do this normally. It wasn't a normal part of the programming. To my knowledge, they never did it with any other band. So it's a little bit of a curious story. I tried to look into it. But anyway, one day, they just effectively showed a music video for They Might Be Giants. In fact, two of them that included the characters from the show. And I was smitten right away.
It was definitely, so it was the Tiny Toons Adventure episode that you first heard them from. So, yeah, for a bit of context for people who aren't aware, so Tiny Toon Adventures was a Steven Spielberg produced Warner Brothers cartoon. So there was a phase in the kind of early 90s where he kind of put his name and produced a bunch of Warner Brothers cartoons, or the Warner Brothers stuff, where they kind of had this kind of like irreverent, almost aim for kids, but there was a level of humour that if the parents had to sit down and watch it, the parents would get just amount of enjoyment. I think there's Tiny Toon Adventures, Animaniacs. I think Freakazoid was another one, and I think there might be one or two more, but I don't know if there was any from.
Yeah, well, our programming, so you're right, it was kind of similar to Looney Tunes, meaning the old Bugs Bunny cartoons in that way, that it was partially aimed at kids, but reasonably sophisticated, let's say. And Tiny Toons would come on. DuckTales was another one that was really big at the time, with Scrooge McDuck and Tailspin. There was a whole slate of these cartoons. I don't know if Spielberg was involved with all of them, but it was a block of television programming that was on. It was designed for kids to come home from school and watch, and I was a latchkey kid back then, and so TV kind of raised me after school, and I watched this stuff religiously.
Yeah, and the episode in question, I think it was the Tiny Toon Music Television, as I've got a Wikipedia page. Well, from the This Might Be a Wiki, which is They Might Be Giants Wikipedia wiki section stuff. So it was 5 tracks which they animated videos with, including some of the characters, and so you had kind of Respect by Aretha Franklin, Money That's What I Want by Barrett Strong, and Top Secret Apprentice by Bruce Broughton. But the 2 songs at the very start included Istanbul, Not Constantinople, and Particle Man.
See, right there, you're reminding me now. I do remember the Berry Gordy Money snippet too, but I had forgotten. For some reason, I thought They Might Be Giants were just dropped into the middle of that. But in any case, it seemed odd to me at the time. But it made an impact.
Yeah, I remember seeing that bit myself, but kind of also like jumping the gun towards my Heat Roger story, which I don't mean to do, but it's very interestingly that kind of is stuck in the consciousness of people, particularly that episode and that kind of the music stuff. So that's how you discovered it stuff. So I'm assuming then you heard the music from the music. How did you find out it was They Might Be Giants? Because
it's a good question. I think what had happened actually was that maybe either around the same time or shortly before, my mother had actually picked up the tape, and I believe it's because she heard something about them on NPR and maybe thought her young son would appreciate their weirdness, which is the key thing I loved about them back then, and I still do. And so maybe, but it just hadn't really took with me. Maybe I had heard a snippet of it, or either that, or they were on my mother's radar as well, and she bought me the tape. But all I know is that shortly after that happened, that I saw them on TV, the cartoon that is, I got a hold of the cassette tape of Flood and connected those two things in my mind. And given that it was pre-internet, I guess the Tiny Toon stuff must have reran a couple times. It certainly feels like I saw it more than once. And then I started listening to the record, and like I said, I was coming from a place, I was a music fan already. I had already bought a few bits of music on my own right around that time, but I was pretty much a child of MTV. I was just watching what MTV put on, and that was telling me what to buy. So the first things I ever bought at the record store were a Motley Crue tape and a Paula Abdul tape. And of course, it was around this time that Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, broke on MTV, and I went and bought that tape. But at the time, it just felt like MTV was just telling me what to buy. I didn't really have my own taste yet. So this was a decided shift in that, and I leaned into it.
Okay, so yeah, it'd be interesting to come back to that, particularly thinking like, oh, I'm pretty sure my young son would do this, because I think there's a pretty much a very wholesome feel to this album, that very wholesome, like very almost family friendly aspect.
It's interesting you
places.
say that. Yeah, you're right. On re-listening, on close listening again in preparation for our conversation, I would agree for the most part. But at the time, I think I thought it was very subversive and just so strange. And to me, the fact that I just didn't hear anything like that on MTV, I think I was tuned in from an early age, and my family gave this to me, and I consider it a blessing. The idea that weird equals cool. If you want to be cool, you have to be sort of an oddball. And then what I found, and I guess it's because I was a little bit of an odd, weird kid, and I'm an odd adult, and that's fine. And then a series of musicians in my life helped reinforce that premise, and They Might Be Giants was sort of the first one. So I don't know. In some ways, to respond to your comment, I agree. It's clean and wholesome to a sense, and that is also colored by the fact that they then went on to make children's music later on, which makes sense. Not like the music changed that much, so I'm not disagreeing with you. But I'm just trying to put myself back in the mindset of myself at 11 or 12. It just seemed so bizarre to me that wholesome was not a word that was occurring to me, certainly.
Okay, so you mentioned that it's like one of the first bands that you kind of like latched onto. So where did this take you? Did you find yourself looking for bands similar to this? Was this like shaping your music taste? Did it have an impact?
It definitely shaped my musical taste. I think I spent the next several years really just diving into their catalog, because this is their third record. And by the time I even really got to them, I think they had already released their follow-up, maybe 2 follow-ups. And then I remember I eagerly awaited the release of, I think it was like the 1994 release or 95 release of John Henry. So I probably just rotated around there. I think if anything, in the moment, what it probably did is cause me to start keeping my ears perked up for the stranger non-hit song aesthetic, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one thing I remember is that I'm very into 70s music, classic rock, things like that nowadays. But and I wasn't resistant to it back then. But I remember that my father, who was a huge Beatles fan, came to me somewhere after this happened and said, "Oh, you're going to like Magical Mystery Tour, because the Beatles have this song called I Am the Walrus, and it's super weird." Like he realized that what I was leaning towards was the bizarre, was the strange. And he used that as an entry point. That was the first Beatles record I heard or really listened to, was Magical Mystery Tour. Not really anyone's favorite in the grand scheme of things, right? Or not often heralded as such. So I think it kind of set me off in that path. I think there were other elements of popular music through the 90s, though, and MTV did start to rotate this stuff in. They had programs that would come on late at night, 120 minutes, where they would play so-called alternative music, stuff that wasn't hip necessarily, or shows like Beavis and Butthead, where kind of the premise of the show was that they were making fun of alternative videos that you would see videos on that show that you wouldn't, and hear songs that you wouldn't hear elsewhere. So I think it just kind of perked up my ears generally, and probably led to it did create a window into the classic rock space, and later people like David Bowie and things like that. This like strange is cool, strange is hip phenomenon.
So kind of like tied into kind of like the launch of like the rise of MTV, the alternative kind of like, I don't want to say grunge, but like that kind of like anti-mainstream stuff that was becoming mainstream to a certain age group in the time.
Yeah.
Gen X, like the rise of Gen X and stuff. So for people who are unaware of who They Might Be Giants are, They Might Be Giants are a Brooklyn-based alternative rock duo formed all the way back in 1982 by John Flansburgh and John Linnell. During the early years, they performed as a duo. And then in the 90s, they expanded to have a backing band. And they were credited as vital in the creation and growth of the prolific DIY music scene in Brooklyn in the mid-1980s. Yeah, so they've been noted for having a very kind of unique style of alternative music, using surreal, humorous lyrics, experimental styles, and unconventional instruments in songs. Yeah,
Yeah,
they
definitely.
yeah they've found success on modern rock and college radio. They've found success in children's music and theme music for television programs and films. Yeah, they've released 23 albums. Yeah, so they've done loads of stuff. Yeah, I find it quite interesting that my obsession with bands from Brooklyn, like constant thing through this podcast. So yeah, so this is another Brooklyn-based band. In terms of my kind of history with the band, so this was an album that I was familiar with. So yeah, so this isn't one that I'm coming to for the first time. So when you mentioned Flood, I was like, oh yeah, I've always kind of wanted to listen to this, but although I think I've listened to a couple of it, and then it was only until I was listening to it, I realised, oh, okay, I have listened to this before. It's just been quite a long time, quite a long time. But for the interest of the people, they might be giants. Weren't like massively big in the UK. I have a vivid memory of kind of Birdhouse in Your Soul when I was about 4 or 5. So it was released in like 1990. So I was 4 at the time. So it was like played in the radio. It got to number 6 in the charts here, and I've always had this kind of memory. So I think it was one of those songs where I kind of was acknowledging it and I was remembering things at that time. So I don't know. I don't know exactly how old children are when they start to remember or associate stuff with music, but I remember particularly in this time I was starting to be more receptive and remembering kind of themes and songs and melodies and stuff. And Birdhouse in Your Soul was something that was always in there and stuff, but and then it kind of like just dropped off. Case in point, 4 months later, Istanbul Not Constantinople was released as a single. It got to number 61. So They Might Be Giants are literally a one-hit wonder in the UK for the most part. And they never really kind of got back into the cultural zeitgeist in the UK at all. The only time their name kind of picked up again was when "Boss of Me" was the theme tune for Malcolm in the Middle,
Right.
and that got to 21 in the charts. So it was released as a single, and I remember kind of downloading that off Kazaa at the time because I was like 15, 16,
Sure.
liking that stuff, and I thought, oh, I really quite like that, and I never really gave him that much mind. And then I can't remember when it was exactly. This must have been about 14, 15 years ago when I was listening to Radio 1, which is one of the bigger high prolific, most listened to radio stations in the UK. And during like one of the bank holiday Mondays, when everyone was off, they had this thing where they said, oh, we're going to have a 10-hour takeover, which means that people can ask to play any song within reason on the radio, so on Radio 1. So if you want to ask us to play something, they'll play it. And then they was playing all these sorts of things that would never be on the Radio 1 playlist, because the Radio 1 playlist was one of these kind of mainstream pop or what's popular, and they only play like the same 30 songs. So they was playing stuff like Vogue by Madonna and all this kind of stuff. And then suddenly someone's saying, oh yeah, we're going to play this song now, and it's "And Your Only Friend," you na 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 na, and I'm like, and suddenly I was like, a spark was like, oh my God, that's that song. That's that song. What was it? Oh, what was that song? What was that song? And then basically it says, oh yeah, that was They Might Be Giants, Birdhouse in Your Soul. I was like, and then by this time the internet was a thing, so I was like Googling it, downloaded that Kazaa. I'm like, oh my God, I finally remember what this song is, that I kind of remembered the melody of. And then I think a couple of years later, I think I might mention this actually in the previous episode. There was a time where I got into going through BitTorrent, don't arrest me please, whole kind of discographies of bands.
Sure.
At one point, and getting really kind of overwhelmed, and after linking, there's too much to get into. And at the time, and I think there's stuff like Chumbawamba, The Cure, They Might Be Giants, and the Bare Naked Ladies. And anyone who's listened to the Bare Naked Ladies album episode that I did all the way back in 2020 probably know that out the lot of them, the Bare Naked Ladies kind of won the band that I listened to the most. But yeah, so I kind of like ended up getting like a few songs from They Might Be Giants stuck in kind of rotation. Like the MP3s are kind of littered on my hard drive for about the last 15 years. And quite a few of them are actually from Flood. And
Nice,
so but then I hadn't really listened to them for ages, and they've always been that kind of band of like thinking of like I need to go back and listen to them because I'm pretty sure I quite like some of the stuff that I've not listened to. So by the time, so when you mentioned Flood, I was like, okay, let's re-listen to this, and memories again, kind of like teenage me listening to Bird Ace in Your Soul. I was like, oh god, yeah, I remember Whistling in the Dark, and it just kind of like clicked, and I remember all the words going, and yeah, so I came to this being really quite excited about to rediscover a band that perhaps I should have given more time to.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Yeah, and I think perhaps as well, this might be one of the albums that aside from perhaps ones that I was more familiar with that people have picked or the mapping episodes, I probably have listened to this album the most out of pretty much any other episode that I've done in the past.
Well,
so.
No, yeah, totally. I mean, you mentioned the Bare Naked Ladies. I think they definitely have a kinship with a band like that. You know, so I've already mentioned the weirdness, but the reality is it's quite poppy. I think it's quite easy to like. They're very good with melody. They do use unconventional instruments, but they don't, and it's possible that the strangeness just doesn't land with me anymore because I've just taken it into my brain so thoroughly. I don't notice how strange the arrangements are or the instrumentation is sometimes. But it's definitely a pop album, and there's a lot of great pop music here. And then the reason I think they're similar to Bare Naked Ladies in that sense, but also the cleverness in songwriting. That was something that was the first time I think I realized you could write a song and be melodic, but also be clever, get off a little pop culture reference, or have a cool little turn of phrase. And there was just a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to mention that you alluded to is, and now that we're middle-aged, in the old days, in the pre-internet days, you'd only have one item from the band at a time, and you could just really take a lot of time with it. And I've had this experience more recently where I discover a band and they have 10 records on Spotify. Who knows where to start? It's overwhelming at times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and occasionally it's like, oh, where do you start? And quite a few times there's quite a few higher profile artists or artists with large catalogues, and the only things that I've really listened to are the greatest hits. I mentioned The Cure, and I think The Cure's greatest hits is the only kind of thing that I remember listening to. I have had friends or former guest Colin, for example, have given me kind of playlists of stuff. Oh, you need to listen to The Cure, mainly because The Cure's his favourite band, and he keeps scaring at me every time I keep bringing this up. But yeah, so it's kind of really weird thing where you're at the point where you're thinking, oh, let's try and try and get into an album. And it's like, okay, what do we listen to? They've got 23 albums. What the hell? Yeah. But I think if you get in a certain time, you don't have that much, and you kind of follow them through and through. So you probably had that kind of thing. So have you pretty much followed the Mike Giants each album, or did you kind of drift off and then realize, crap, there's 5 albums to listen to? Or?
Yeah, I drifted off, I think, by the end of the 90s, and just was into a different kind of music at that point. And I kept up with them in a very general way, but I didn't keep buying all their records, so I definitely have not listened to all of their records all the way through. But I would say, during this time, after I got into Flood, I went back and listened to the 2 records that came before this, which I think are great, and maybe the 3 records that came after this I'm quite familiar with, or maybe 4. And after that, it fell off a little bit. I did have a lucky chance to meet them. They did a little book signing in San Francisco. This is probably over 10 years ago now. And played a short little concert for a bunch of kids. So it was mostly people there with their 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. And me and my buddy just went just to say hi to them and watch them because it was a small place. And just tell them, I just shook their hands and said, you guys meant a lot to me. Weird is cool.
No, yeah. So yeah, I get the impression they kind of appreciated that, or they get that. They probably get that all the time.
Sure.
Yeah, but yeah.
I mean, in case I'm not, maybe I'm overstating the case, but to a weird, oddball little kid, that became an important foundation of all my confidence going forward. Not just, part of it's your confidence that you have taste in music, which has shaped a lot of my life. But just confidence in general that even though you might not be you're not the popular kid in high school, which I was not, doesn't matter. You actually know what's cool. And I had a certain self-confidence and bands like They Might Be Giants, ideas like this really help me along, I would say.
Yeah. So the album itself. Let's actually go to talk about the album as a whole itself. They kind of like go for like humorous, perhaps almost poignant at times. They kind of balance between the two of them. So like they've got like really weird off kilter song meanings. So like songs you think, oh, that's really nice, and you read about what the song's actually about, and it's like, oh, it's actually kind of mundane or like things you wouldn't sing songs about.
Sure.
Like nightlights, or even like murderers in jail or something like that.
I always think there's two songwriters in the band and two singers, right? You mentioned the two Johns, who are and really those are the only two members of the band, although they've often been supported with larger scale bands, but it's really those two guys. And they definitely have different songwriting styles. I think Flansburgh is more poppy, a little more grounded, maybe. And so songs like Lucky Ball and Chain, that's definitely a Flansburgh song. And songs like Dead and Whistling in the Dark, those are definitely Linnell's songs. He's just much stranger person, I think.
So, actually, here's the question that I realise that I don't know the answer to. Who's who?
The guy with glasses is Flansburgh, and he plays the guitar, I think, on most of the stuff. They probably both do a variety of things. And Linnell does a lot of the keyboards, accordion, and he also plays sax. I know I might be missing some instruments, but I think that was the genesis of it. And maybe they both worked together on things like drum programming in the early days.
Okay, so Flansburgh, I think he's the one who sings the lead and Boss of Me, and I think John Linnell's the one who sings on Birdhouse, or at least the verses of Birdhouse
Correct.
in Your Soul. So they've
yes.
So they kind of flip between the two different vocalists, which again is a plus for me. I mean, complete plus for me. I mean, for a good chunk of the Bare Naked Ladies, it was Ed Robinson and Stephen Page, and then I think after he left, they kind of let Jim Duggan and Kevin Hearn kind of sing. So the multiple vocalists is like a real big like checkbox that I love in bands. So that kind of ticks that for me as well. But yeah, so it's that kind of like balance between the kind of like humor, the off kilter, and just like the kind of like unafraid to just be weird and experiment.
Yeah, it has an experimentalness to it. Their earlier stuff even more so, and so this is another thing that I think is important context for them, is they kind of came out of this New York scene of experimental. The early days of what one might call art rock, and it was coming off of the time of punk, the punk explosion in New York. And I think what punk did for a lot of they don't sound very punk at all, but what it got out there into the culture was the idea that anything can be a band. There's no rules anymore. I think that's part of the barrier that punk as a genre really helped break down. And so then They Might Be Giants are an example. I think they would play like galleries, and they would just play a lot of weird venues. And it does have a little art project element to it, especially in those early days. They're playing with a drum machine, which is just inherently strange and audacious, I think. The guy's got an accordion. Other than Weird Al, who plays the accordion? Like, that's not a common rock and roll instrument, right? So,
yeah, exactly. They're just like, again, experimental. Just think, oh, can we do this? Let's try it and see how it sounds. And they managed to kind of create pop songs that would both sound like they would be on radio, but then also wouldn't be. And there's a kind of like nice little kind of shifts that kind of like break almost normal pop song convention.
There's a lot of interesting musical touches in there, but they're also grounded in Beatles-based rock. Great melody, great chords, etc.
Yeah, so it's kind of like how you've got, so kind of like particularly at the time, this kind of predates grunge, but not the sound, but the ideal of going against convention or saying, what's happening at the moment? What's happening with rock music? I think, yeah. So this is even like seeming to go against what was being against at the time as well. So you'd have, kind of like the rise of rock music in the late 80s, early 90s. So like the stuff you've got, but then you've got, so that you got it on the West Coast, on the East Coast, you've got the rise of these kind of like independent DIY, quirky, Brooklyn-based bands doing their thing and just
I think the movements are definitely related. You mentioned DIY, do-it-yourself movement, which I think began to take hold right as, again, I think coming off of the punk movement, which just said, there are no rules. Let's rewrite the rules. Do everything yourself. Figure it out, whatever the constraints might be. Do you not have a record label to support you? Screw it. Keep playing shows. Keep making music. And I think that a lot of bands throughout the 80s, the generation right before the Nirvanas and the Pearl Jams and the Soundgardens, and to a lesser extent them too, all embrace that ethos of let's just tour and let's try to find ways to get our music out there to the world, and there are no rules, let's just figure it out mentality. Whereas in the 70s, every tour had to be booked by a record label, for instance.
Yeah, it's like a case of let's just be who we want to be. Let's just sing what we want to sing about. Let's make no attempt at being who we're like. Let's not try and pretend to be someone we're not. Let's just be us. And I think that this album kind of, from listening to it, kind of has that kind of like feel to it. So it's just like, yeah, we're coming in with like not really any kind of like mission statement or intent. We just got like, oh, wouldn't it be funny to write a song about this, or just have this weird idea. What if you just wrote a 2-minute song about it? And
well, the irony is that this is kind of their major label debut. Elektra, if you can call Elektra a major label, it kind of went up and down over the years, Elektra, but it started out as like a folk label in the 60s, and then they signed The Doors and bands like Love, and they had a lot of success in maybe the late 60s, early 70s. I'm not 100% sure how big they were at this point, but this is them moving from a really small indie to at least a more established player, and they got more money and more studio time and more access to studio musicians, which I think shows in the production. But at the same time, they seem to retain complete creative control because, again, it's so weird. It's clearly just the vision of these two guys.
Yeah, and we have a collection of, in Flood, we have a collection of about 19 tracks on this album, and it's only 43 minutes long. So yeah, so basically a lot of short songs, which is happy with me for. Yeah, so the person, the long song hating Matt isn't going to be invoked in this one. So you've got 19 songs to go through this as well, and it bleeds through. So yeah, so we probably won't have time, as always. We probably won't have time to go through every single one of them. But let's move on to try and get through a fair few of them. So I'm going to ask Rob, which songs jump out to you when you think of this album?
Yeah, well, to go from the biggest highlight to me is Istanbul, Not Constantinople. Because A, that's the first song I ever heard from them. But listening back to it again, and I should point out, they didn't write this song. It was a cover of a tune that was made back in the 50s.
I just learned that 5 minutes ago when you was talking, and I went onto the Wikipedia page. So this is like mind blowing. I thought it was them.
So to be fair, I can't credit them with all the cool aspects of the arrangement because some of those pieces are taken from, I can't think of the artist offhand, but Bing Crosby does a version of this song back in either the 40s or the 50s. Anyway, but it's a funny song. It educates, it tells you about geography and a little bit about history. And I just think the production really stands out. They have the violin on there, super competent player. They have just some really nice production touches of how they use their voices, not just as harmonizing elements, but also as rhythmic elements. There's some wailing, there's some mouth bass. As a production and as a mission statement song for They Might Be Giants, I think this was the right one to put forth onto Tiny Toons, which they did.
No, yeah, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. It's a kind of off-kilter, kind of like almost the Wikipedia page said it's kind of like a parody song of, or a novelty song, written on the 500th anniversary of the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. The lyrics humorously refer to the official renaming of the city of Constantinople to Istanbul. The song's original release, performed by the Four Lads, was certified a gold record numerous cover versions that were recorded over the years, most famously by Mighty Giants. But apparently, the song is said to response to Constantinopple, recorded in 1928 by Paul Whiteman and his orchestra. So
I haven't heard that one.
No, I'm just learning a load of stuff from here. I thought it was a They Might Be Giants song. I had no idea it was a cover version. But no, I completely agree with you.
But it sounds like a song they would write. So I think that here's a note to any band out there thinking about recording a cover of something. It has to, either you have to totally make it your own, as in, say, Devo doing the Rolling Stones song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which they completely remade as a Devo song. Perfect, in my opinion. Or it has to sound like a song your band would already write. And this is that. So yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's also, again, a very interesting kind of like almost history lesson, or just to, probably not, you probably can't cite it in a history exam, but it does kind of like touch upon the fact that it was kind of Istanbul, Constantinople. I'm pretty sure that this song helped me win a quiz question.
Sure.
Quiz.
Well, they also drop in that New York used to be called New Amsterdam. Yeah, there's a couple tidbits in there.
Yeah. It goes, but and again, kind of like it's like kind of introduction to the duo as well, because the way they kind of play with voices. So you got the kind of like back and forth between the two of them, and the habit of them going really low and going like a really low baritone voice, which comes up again a few times in the album.
There's so many great parts to it, but I think from the very opening too, it really grabs your attention because they have that violin, which is not, I don't think the violin is anywhere else on the record or on their previous records. That's a studio musician. But the way they do it is they have kind of a chaotic soloing violin that's fading in. So it comes in on a fade in. And then I like this technique, and I can't think of another song right now that does this, but it's cool where you're kind of getting this chaotic arrhythmic solo that then locks into the rhythm, and then the song starts. To me, that's just like a cool get ready for the song trick.
And I think as well, you've got almost traditional Turkish instrumental kind of soundscapes that are playing through as well, which I'm going to assume is probably a little bit in the original. But I'm assuming it's probably just in that as well.
Yeah, it's done in some. I didn't examine it super closely, but it's done in some kind of harmonic minor type scale that is associated with the East, some kind of Eastern scale that has more of those diminished intervals, more of those half steps in there, semitones, as you would call them. And the original doesn't have anything like that violin part, but it does have the wailing part, the oh, which also gives me this very strong sense of the East, in quotes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's just a lot on this that's really fun. It's very catchy as well, and it'll also just stick in the memory.
Sure.
But saying surprisingly, this didn't do near as well as Birdhouse in the UK. It's got 61, so no one listened to this at all in the UK. But,
no, I mean, I think it's kind of the same in the US. I don't have all the facts and figures, but I think in total this might have sold 40,000 copies, certified. And you mentioned that, Birdhouse and Your Soul probably did okay on college radio, and it was still the relatively early days of college radio. But I think also what happened, we alluded to it, is that grunge came out shortly after this, and I think dictated. Of course, there was always an alternative parallel line of college radio and people who liked stuff like this. But there was also a great sea change in music that happened shortly after this came out, which is when Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, etc. came out. And I just think that shifted a lot of people's attention to harder rock.
Yeah, I think I kind of see as... But I don't... This kind of alternative rock probably wasn't as big as Britpop was in the UK, but then I think Britpop was on the rise, but lasted about 2 years before the Spice Girls came in and obliterated Britpop and brought in a new version of pop music. So I think grunge had that same kind of impact. In the US. But I think it's a fun song. I had no idea it was a cover, but where do you want to move on to next?
Yeah, so the other really big song for me is the song Minimum Wage. And I picked that because it had I think it might have had the biggest effect on me of any song on this tape. It's a 46-second long song, but it still sounds, at least it sounds like a really big production. Like there's a lot going on. It sounds like it's pulled from some old film or something. And it just recall that it just has one line where a guy shouts minimum wage and then you hear a bullwhip crack. And like I said, under a minute long, but I played this a lot and it just really, this told me, a young me, hey, what is a song? What can be a song? Anything can be a song. You decide what is a song.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was really audacious and experimental, but also fun. And I had never worked a day in my life, of course, when I was 12 and listening to this, but I knew what they were talking about. They were talking about the plight of the working man very generally and kind of making light of it. So yeah, I don't know. It just had a big impact for such a short tune.
Yeah, it's like kind of instrumental in the background. Apparently, looking at the Genius annotations or the about, apparently the whip crack at the start was created in the studio, combining the snap of a towel and a Moog synthesized wind sound.
Interesting.
Yeah, apparently instrumentation was largely cribbed from Frank Sinatra's cover of Petula Clark's Downtown, which as well. Which I
didn't know that. Well, it's funny because I already mentioned Devo, but I was reading also how 7 years before that they created the whip crack sound for Whip It. Long story short is you can't just bring a bullwhip into the studio and expect to capture that sound very effectively. Maybe you can now, but not back then. So they had to do it through some kind of synthesized, reversed, put the sound in reverse and like suck it out really quick to get the sense of a whip crack.
Yeah, you need a really big studio as well because from my understanding, a bullwhip is really, really long. You need the room. You'd have to have the room to do that. So,
well, you also need a guy who knows how to use it, or a lady, obviously, because I think you can hurt yourself pretty easily with that thing.
Oh yeah, I'm not touching a bullwhip with a barge pole or a stiff bullwhip. I mean, the metaphor. I had the metaphor in my head. Yeah, no, minimum wage. I think it's like a song. It's kind of like one of those kind of not filler tracks, like a transitional track that like kind of or like a
sure.
But it's not exactly a skit, but doesn't feel like a song either. It's just like a. It's like I think it kind of amplifies like, yeah, this is who They Might Be Giants are. Yeah, this is what like 25 minutes into the album. If you're not with They Might Be Giants at this point,
for sure. And I think that's what always strikes me, or what struck me listening to this again, is how much variety there is.
Mm-hmm.
It's all pop music in a very general sense, but they change the tonality of the songs quite a bit. From almost like country numbers, like Lucky Ball and Chain, to these Eastern numbers like Istanbul, to something like this, which just has this, he's got a big ballpark organ going on, or like you said, maybe that's partly a sample. I don't know. They jump around a lot. So I think it also imbued in me a love of the variety of songs on an album, that a given record does not have to conform to a certain genre, that you should just produce each song, do what the song is telling you to do. And that's the path I've mostly tried to follow in my music making career, is not care too much about genre, but instead focus on the song and what the song's telling you to do. And that might lead you to something that sounds like 70s soul, or it might lead you to psych rock, or it might lead you to, country. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I totally agree on that. So, where do you want to move on to next?
Another one that jumps out to me, I mean, you mentioned it, Birdhouse in Your Soul.
This is one of my favorite songs. I love this song.
It's great. Yeah, it's a very well composed song. There's a lot to unpack.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a complaint, and you might know that I have a podcast myself called 1001 Album Complaints, where we complain about stuff, even the stuff we love, because I do believe that as music fans, it's fun to talk about why they made certain decisions. But I've always been bumped by the fact that the lead vocal, is so low when this song starts. I think they've screwed up on the volume or on the mixing. It's it gets louder later. But right at the beginning, it feels so low as to almost be imperceptible when he's singing the verse. I just think that's bizarre. But in any case, it's a great song. It's well composed. And I remember there's another thing that jumped out to me because, of course, I listened to this one a bunch, and it is poppy. I don't think I ever heard it on any radio station. I know I saw that this was the first single they released, and you mentioned it got a little bit of traction in the UK. I'm not sure if it did in the US or not, but I don't think I ever saw it or heard it out in the wild. But they reference, they make two references. Like, there was a lot to unpack here reference wise. So they reference the Longines Symphonette, which in the pre-internet days, of course, I had no idea what that was. It was not contained in my World Book encyclopedia. And they also mentioned Jason and the Argonauts, which I did know what that was because I had seen the movie. But I think I love the references. I was a big Simpsons fan at this time and felt like I kind of grew up with The Simpsons. And what The Simpsons were really good at is making a lot of referential humor. And what that led me to was a path of discovery to try to get the references. Yeah. So I often credit a show like The Simpsons with sending me off in a lot of directions to go watch certain movies or get certain references or listen to certain music or read certain books. And I think They Might Be Giants kind of embed a lot of similar stuff in their songs, and these are some examples.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. But I think the thing with this as well is that I think it's just, this is one of those songs that is like very kind of wholesome, and like when initially thinking, oh, it's kind of a nice love song, but then you read about what it's about, and it's actually quite quite blatant and not really that kind of ambiguous in what it's about. It is basically about a children's nightlight in the shaped in like a blue canary. It's a kind of nice, unique kind of thing to sing a song about. And I think the instrumentation and the kind of choices it does are slightly off kilter. I think it's like how the song completely changes melody halfway through the chorus. Yeah. So like the bird has your soul, and he goes, it's the bird has your soul. He goes, not to point a point, not to put a fine to point on it. Say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. It's just that kind of quick like handbrake turn where it just seems to change the instruments and the rhythm of it before kicking back into the birdhouse in your soul bit.
Well, think about how adult even that sentiment is of say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Because of course I was singing along to that when I was a kid, and I think at the time I understood it to mean, I didn't understand the phrase "be in your bonnet." I thought it was just about being close to someone, right? But really what "be in your bonnet" means is to be annoying to someone. But now, having been married for a number of years, I realize how accurate that is to a realistic portrayal of love, which is I should be the one that annoys you the most, in a loving way.
Yeah, I think it's just like very like weird turns of phrases, which, I mean, "be in your bonnet," I actually thought it was, again, thinking it was a love song at first. I think let me be the only person in your bonnet, or like a kind of like metaphor of being the only one or something like that. But yeah. But then again, I think particularly when I was a child, I had a night light, not like a bird light. I had a bulb in the center light, which was a night light, which never worked until it was completely dark.
Right. Okay.
So like the idea of a night light was always there and stuff, and it was like at some point it was like a point of contention of whether do I get it changed or. At what point, at what age should I finally stop using a nightlight? And I think it was last week I finally gave up. No, it was not earlier. It was a lot earlier than that. But it's quite surprising how much a nightlight has a hold on someone, particularly someone of a very young age.
Sure.
And particularly as something as well, like if it's a shape, like again of a little bird, and a little kind of like a bird and stuff, but then like the birdhouse in your soul, I think particularly when you're young, you kind of like associate or grow attachments to stuff, like childhood toys or like sentimental stuff, or like you've got like young children who probably have a blanket that they have with them that they have to have, or they have, or something that they have to have, or they throw a tantrum if they can't find what they need to have at all times. And I think there's like an interesting association that you get with that, or like a
Sure.
sentimentality you have with like inanimate objects that you do as a child. And I quite like how this song kind of conveys that kind of relationship, or like that one-way relationship that you can have with things, or like and particularly with this, like it's a guardian against the dark. So like
Yeah.
I mean, as a child, I was bloody scared of the dark when I was a kid. That's why I had to have a nightlight, and stuff. And it's just nice that you have that kind of safety kind of blanket, or a guardian, or just something that helps give you a sense of courage as a child. And this song has that, just manages to convey that feeling really, really well, and just manages to just generate kind of like lyrics that are very much unique and describe what it's. So the whole second verse. The second verse is the talking about this photo of a lighthouse, and the way he describes it is brilliant. Is really good. So it's like there's a picture opposite me of my primitive ancestry, which stood on rocky shores and kept the beaches shipwreck free. And although I respect that a lot, I'd be fired if that was my job. After killing Jason off and counting the screaming Argonauts, I love that verse. I love that line. It just conjures up a kind of interesting kind of like visual, and again anthropomorphizes this kind of like guardian looking out over this like child or young family or whatever. And yeah, I struggle to find out anyone who, if anyone who doesn't like this song must not have any soul. I mean, it's just I just really love this kind of like uplifting song. And yeah, and I'm just glad I'm in a position to talk about this song on the podcast. It is one of my favorites. So
it's a lovely song. I know, I agree. It's very well executed, and hats off to the drum programming. I think throughout this record, they really can make it pretty easy for you to forget they don't have a live drummer. I think they're quite deft at using that. I normally get bumped by things like that because I think the drum machines, how they're used a lot of times, is very limited, and this has just a lot of dynamics. I agree, you can, if you dial your ears in, you can hear that it's a drum machine, of course, but they don't let it hold back the dynamics of the song or how it's going to change or what drama they're going to put in the songs. And this is an example of that for sure. I wanted to mention too, man, they do a cool little musical trick that I've always liked melodically at the end of this song, which is the last, in the kind of super chorus at the end, they kind of tag it melodically with that leave the nightlight on inside the birdhouse in your soul. Like they introduce a new melody and they're kind of crossing paths, and it just kind of puts it's a little unexpected new, also catchy melody that they really only do once in the song.
Yeah.
And it leaves you wanting more. For a pop song, I think that's just a good trick, because normally when pop songwriters find a melody they like that works over chords, they go, well, that's going to be the chorus. I'm obviously going to do that more than once. But to write something, a little line like that, and only deploy it one time in the song, I think that suggests a certain confidence.
Yeah, and there's also I don't know what the instrument is. It sounds like an out-of-tune saxophone played really badly, which somehow fits.
That might be the accordion that you're talking about, because I feel like that is kind of the sound of the accordion, or it could be a saxophone. Like I said, one of the Johns plays sax.
But it's not fully in tune, and it's not played perfectly. Again, it's like someone trying to learn to play saxophone, but it somehow again fits, and it doesn't feel jarring.
You're talking about the little rhythmic background thing over the verse. I have a secret to tell. Digga, 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 digga. It's like kind of wobbly, that thing?
No. There's a bit in it where it goes, wow, 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 wow.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. That's got to be a sax. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it just feels slightly out of tune before it goes to I'm your only. Where in the video it's like the floating head and stuff. And yeah. And before we end up talking for another 15, 20 minutes about the song as much as I can, if anyone's ever seen the literal music videos that are on YouTube about 12, 13 years ago, where they redo the songs but just sing about what's happening in the videos. One of the first ones I ever saw was for this video. So it's
nice.
Like, I'm a floating head. No, I'm not really a floating head.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those. Yeah.
And sometimes like sometimes that video, particularly on the lead up to this, the lyrics for that has often overtaken my brain with the lyrics to the actual song. So yeah, so it's like
Totally.
yeah, so it's like I command a solo jump. So but, yeah, so let's quickly move on before I derail and carry on talking about
Sure.
the song. So where do you want to move on to next?
Okay, this one is the last song on the record, Road Movie to Berlin. And I just wanted to call it out for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's just one of my favorite melodies on the record. It's kind of understated. I feel like this is the one I'm most likely to play myself at the piano, you know, if I'm just goofing around. But it's also it's straightforward in the verse, and then it has these very weird, bombastic breaks. And so, just again, the way that they're willing to jump between styles to me was always interesting. I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't have any sense of, they were probably writing this when the Berlin Wall was up. I'm sure it had some meaning. I haven't looked too deeply into the meaning. But for some reason, maybe because it's the closing track, this melody kind of floats around in my head quite a bit.
Yeah, it's because when it opens up. I often thought this was They Might Be Giants poking fun at the Smiths, because I don't think it's deliberate, or perhaps that's not what they're doing, but there seems to be a like almost impression of Morrissey.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good call. I see what you're saying now. And I like the Smiths too, so that might say something.
Yeah. Opinions about Morrissey notwithstanding, but
sure.
But there's just something like kind of like almost parody. It's the voice of Morrissey, I think, more than the instrumentation. So I don't think they're kind of the instrumentation goes into more of a kind of like show tuney, and then like that very weird but welcome kind of random blast of alternative rock that just kicks in before going back to like the jazz hall.
Totally. Well, also there is that sentiment in there that St. Peter comes out and gives them medals, declaring us the nicest of the damned. Mm-hmm. I went to Catholic school for my entire upbringing, and so I think that joke just kind of landed on me, you know. But that also feels like a Morrissey sentiment to me.
Yeah, like you got to the gates of heaven, but then like not really here. Yeah, you're gonna have to turn around, which
just missed it.
Yeah, which actually is a Morrissey kind of line, I think. To think about it, but it's a very kind of like inverse of perhaps what I'm usually into. I'm quite into my happy, upbeat songs, which are actually really depressing when you read the lyrics. This is like a very slow, almost depressing song with like kind of upbeat, kind of like quite humorous lyrics throughout of it. I mean, reading through, I'm beginning to think this might actually be a parody of the Smiths and Morrissey, because it's like the bridge is like, time won't find the lost, it'll sweep up our skeleton bones, so take the wheel and I'll take the pedals, which I think is almost a like the end that goes out pastiche.
No, like I said, I hadn't thought of that before, but that is resonating with me for sure.
But I think a very interesting way to end the album. But then again, though, I think I've always that I think a kind of like a nice way to end an album is to kind of have the closing number as the penultimate song, and then kind of end with like a weird kind of afterthought or post kind of like last minute, almost encore-esque song to kind of like ease the listener from like the album as a whole, like narrative type thing. So like an epilogue, so to speak, after the finale.
Totally.
So yeah, I think this kind of works in that way. But actually, probably inadvertently choosing the next one, because the one before that, it kind of feels like it's the ending, which is the They Might Be Giants song. Sure,
the theme song.
Yeah, which I think actually kind of is a better ending for the album, or like if you picture it as like a live show of Flood, so like you've got a musical, this is the closing number, the curtain call, where all the cast come out and
that's
sing.
fair. You wouldn't end on the slow song in that case. I agree.
Yeah,
I think this always makes me think, or I assume they were thinking of the Monkees theme song.
Yes,
and Actually, I hadn't thought about it until just now, but this definitely influenced me quite strongly as well. The idea that bands should have a theme song. And so my band that I was really dedicated to in my 20s, and I even released music under that name recently, The Chop. But in the beginning, when we were super into it, I was obsessed with the idea of putting the name of the band, like having theme songs, making it clear, making sure that no one who could watch our performances at the bar would not know what our name was. And we just talked a lot about that concept of kind of hammering home the thematic elements of it. And so I also watched the Monkees in reruns when I was a kid because they were playing that on TV in the 80s, even though it was made in the 60s or 70s or something. But this song probably helped too. And we haven't talked yet, right? But I mean, I was such an obsessive fan that I went to the video store and I rented the movie that their name is based on. This is They Might Be Giants is a film.
Okay.
With George C. Scott in it.
I did not know that.
I mean, right, few would because it wasn't a huge production, but George C. Scott was a pretty big actor, and I think it's intended in that context to be kind of a Don Quixote thing, where this guy, the George C. Scott character, I can't remember all the details, but he's a detective working some like lost cause kind of case. He's kind of aging, and yeah, they might be giants, they might be windmills in the distance, or they might be nothing.
Yeah, okay, I wasn't aware it was a film, so wow. It's interesting.
I haven't watched it since I was 14, probably, but so I can't tell you if it's any good, but I found that curious as well. But anyway, the fact that they have their own theme song to me was cool.
Yeah, every day's a school day. But no, I completely agree. Like, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of other bands that have theme songs. They don't really have any. I mean, there's not really much of a kind of self-referential thing. Like,
I think it's because it's considered uncool to a lot of people, and so I think it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, like the majority of rap artists have got songs named after themselves, like saying that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, how many times has Eminem got songs flipping Eminem and Slim Shady in there?
That's the whole. Yeah, you're right. It's a hip hop ethos to say your name often, and I remember it came back to me as a kernel of when I was in my 20s and I was thinking about starting a band, all this stuff. I would go to shows, or I remember going to a show one time at a bar and seeing a band I liked, and then they finished their set and they left, and I was like, I don't know what they're called, and I never found out. And I turned to my buddy and I was like, they should have a freaking flag behind them that says their name, or the bass drum head should say their name, or they should have mentioned it way more times. So to me, that's the idea. There is this, especially in the 90s, especially with stuff like grunge, but really probably throughout the musical history, people have just been a little hesitant to self-promote. And hip-hop went the entire other way with that.
Yeah.
And I think that was smart.
Yeah, exactly. So any band that hasn't must create their own, which makes me hilariously to think that of all the bands that probably would be the least appropriate to have their own theme song in the style of this. So, Tom York, if you're listening, Radiohead needs a jaunty theme song. Hey, we're Radiohead.
Well, they're supposedly named after a Talking Heads song called Radiohead.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, actually, yeah. I was thinking of like all the bands that should have. Yeah, like again, talking about the Smiths. I mean, they probably don't. They probably shouldn't have a theme tune. Don't think about it, but so yeah, where do you want to move on to next in terms of the songs?
Well, the only other one I wrote down was Lucky Ball and Chain, and I think maybe this is my favorite pop song on the record. It's just a pure. It could go in the American songbook, right? It could enter into the real book. I could see a lot of different people taking this one on. And so I love it. It's charming. It's simple. I like simple stuff. But also I like that, and they use this technique a lot, where throughout the song, it's dawning on you that you're listening to an unreliable narrator.
Okay.
And I think they can wring some interesting stuff or some cleverness out of that. And there's some good clever lines in here too. But the idea that it's somebody lamenting, someone who walked out on him, and first you're feeling bad for him, and then sort of over time, you're going, wait a minute, actually, this guy's kind of an ass.
Ah. So yeah, so I was trying to think about as you kind of like start to see, hang on, he's trying to embellish the truth, and then as he kind of starts slipping or admitting things, you're like, oh, okay, you're not telling us the whole truth. It's
I don't know. Maybe I inserted that, but there's just sort of something about it that turns him from sympathetic to unsympathetic over time to me.
yeah, but I think it kind of works. But I think he kind of like a nice again. I think the words kind of pastiche is probably relevant here as well in terms of the kind of like forlorn, like oh she left me, kind of thing, and then it's just like. But then, as the person's trying to explain this song, you just start to get a better idea of the person that's singing, and oh, okay, he's not telling the truth, or he's embellishing certain parts and stuff. And
although that said, I do like that he comments that I was young and foolish then. I feel old and foolish now. I relate to that sentiment.
Yeah, yeah, like people like we never really grow up, do we? But
what's really changed?
Exactly, yeah. But I also think like she walks away from a happy man, which basically changes that line. I think he's walking away from a happy marriage. But like again, that kind of idea of like perhaps potentially someone not kind of growing up and not realizing perhaps that the narrator's the issue than the person that they're singing about. Kind of reminds me a lot actually of What's My Age Again by Blink-182, where it's like if you do a deep dive. A deep analytical dive on Blink-182's What's My Age Again, there's actually kind of a underlying kind of darkness and kind of underlying kind of like introspection in that. That you can read into.
I hear you.
I think you can, and I think there's perhaps one or two times you can do that with They Might Be Giants, where you look at the kind of more serious kind of have they got something to say rather than just being kind of quirky, and stuff. And it's just like in the hair, I think with this one, you've got like a level of someone kind of realizing that, shoot, I should have been perhaps a bit more mature. Right, and I think that's kind of and I think that kind of works on quite a few levels, which I think is a testament to kind of the kind of clever songwriting that both Johns are kind of capable of. So,
yep.
So yeah, so you haven't really. So that was the last ones that you had notes on. Okay, before we move on, there's one or two that I kind of want to talk about myself.
Sure.
Going back to Tiny Toons, the one we haven't talked about that was on that one is Particle Man.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, which, again, I think is probably a lot more associated with the video based on it, which is basically, if no one's, the episode of Tiny Toons features, I think, the kind of child version of Daffy, which is Plucky Duck, being Particle Man in a wrestling ring against the characters that are in the song, but basically getting his absolute arse handed to him.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the band themselves have denied that there's anything kind of more darker to it. It's one of these kind of like just comedy songs, which is like take it at face value, where you've got a kind of weak wrestler getting his arse kicked.
Yeah, I think in some ways this isn't one of my favorite They Might Be Giants song. I think everything on this record has charm, to be clear. And so I do like them, and I don't really find any of them to be things I would necessarily skip. It's kind of all part of the experience. But if I had to choose, I mean, on the one hand, this is sort of a prototypical They Might Be Giants song. It's weird, doesn't really mean anything. This kind of oompa beat going on, which they do like. I think particularly John Linnell likes. Maybe I've just worn it out a little bit. I've heard it a few too many times. It's cool. I don't know what he's talking about. Is there something deeper going on here at all? I don't know.
No, I think they've actually denied there's anything deeper on this, so it's not really one you can kind of read into, despite the fact that like there is kind of like elements you could type in about the idea of universes and people and like that were insignificant in comparison. But I will
say I do like the line. He's got a watch with a minute hand, millennium hand, and an eon hand. I think that still strikes me as funny.
Yeah. Other one I kind of want to bring on is Your Racist Friend.
Yeah.
Which I think is basically about someone very disappointed that they know someone who's racist, which perhaps, like, since this was in 1990, kind of a bit ahead of the time.
Yeah,
pointing out, like calling
it's
out.
it's yeah, it's a little. It strikes me as a little They Might Be Giants, a little direct for them, and so it stands out for that reason. But I actually think the construction of the song, the production is quite nice. But I'm not used to them being as literal in their lyrics, I think.
Yeah, I think it's more about I think it's less about the kind of obscure kind of things that they're talking about. Is that they're just singing about something that perhaps isn't sung about as much in a kind of very literal kind of way. But but then so even the verses are just basically like almost conversational, in like nice party, but then basically you had this one friend who just kept spewing racist stuff, and I just don't know how you can stand or just support the views that your friend has and stuff, which is
I mean, sadly, we've all been there too. Just like, why am I here? Who am I listening to? Am I supposed to cause a scene? Should I punch this guy in the nose? I mean, not. Hopefully, or in my personal experience, it's never been so egregious. But certainly, people who are just being dum-dums. That happens to everybody.
The last one I want to bring up was "Whistling in the Dark," which is one of the ones it's always stuck with me. So that was one of the ones I think when I first listened to it years and years ago. That kind of tune always kind of stuck with me. But I think I'm not sure who's taken the lead vocal between the two of them. But this is the very deep voice.
Sure, I'm confident that it's got to be John Linnell, and it's his style of song for sure. But yeah, I don't know if that's just him singing low. Could be, or they could have. There's a trick you can do where you speed up the song and then you tape the vocal at that higher key and then you put it back down to normal and you get kind of so there could be like a weird effect aspect going on.
Yeah, but it's just like I think of the way that he sings. He's just talking about it, and there's a nice quote from John Linnell actually, where he goes, "I thought it would be funny if there were two guys who would have a seemingly brief hostile interaction, and the camera pulls back, and they're actually in jail together. Bear in mind, if you insist on interpreting the words to this particular song, that the narrator is comfortable and capable in the role of being what he's like. However, as the wise men say, is not an ought," which I think is quite interesting because the actual lyrics actually end up being quite dark in terms of the narrator and what they're singing about.
I was just gonna say, I think this is kind of another prototypical oompa John Linnell song. I don't love it. The part I like best is the breakdown at the end where all the voices are kind of crisscrossing. I think that's pretty cool. But other than that, it's a little plodding for me. Again, nothing actually skippable. I do like all the songs on this record, but if we had to kind of prioritize them, that's sort of what I'd be thinking.
No, I can definitely see that. But I've always kind of liked this one. I think it's the very low voice he uses in the middle of the song, and the very simple melody he uses when he sings.
Right.
Yeah, it's one of those songs that you kind of like when you're singing along, you have to kind of change your voice to kind of match you. So you're talking very much like this, some blah blah blah. I promise this is the last time I talk like this for the next 5 minutes. But I think looking at the time, there's still plenty of songs we haven't had a chance to go through. But again, very very brief, very short, very snappy, very breezy, and the album runs because of the amount of songs, but how short they are. It doesn't feel like it overstays its welcome. So yeah, I quite like how he just manages to kind of feel there's like highlights throughout. So in terms of the reception, it kind of like was quite positive reviews. Although I think did have some odd critics. I think AllMusic gives it 4 out of 5. Chicago Tribune 3.5 out of 4. Los Angeles Times 3 out of 5. NME gave it 8 out of 10. Pitchfork gave it 8.5, and I'll look at what they say in a second.
Well, I did look at what Pitchfork said, but they didn't write that review until 2022. So they like to do that little trick where they backdate what's now cool, and so you gotta always look at the original posting date for Pitchfork. I don't really trust those guys.
Okay, so yeah, they've done that a few times where they've kind of like done a retrospective review and like either removed the old or just not. And it's
Yeah,
not,
this is one of those. And I do think this is one of those records that with the passage of time becomes easier to like. Maybe a lot of stuff is like that, but
no, I agree. Actually, I think it's one of those. I've got a feeling they in 1990, if Pitchfork was around, it would have gotten a much lower review, easily a
I
much lower
would,
review.
yes, I would think so. Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah, it'd be a person going, "What the hell is this?" 4.5.
I think a part of it is that in that time we've just gotten way more used to the idea. We've said the word novelty song a couple times, and I think for a long time you could argue that that's what They Might Be Giants' bread and butter is the novelty songs. And novelty songs have a long history. I don't know, Monster Mash comes to mind. There's a bunch. But I feel like in the intervening 30 years since this came out, the line between what is a novelty song and what is a regular pop song has been blurred quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that Stone Giants have taken the concept of novelty and tried to make art or something slightly more meaningful and more serious about novelty. So whereas novelty might be just like a bunch of fun, and you can tell they're having fun doing what they're doing, but they take having fun quite seriously. So they kind of want to do something, but still maintain that they are having fun as well. So so when you have songs that are a lot bit more interesting and perhaps have deeper layers, they still have this sense of, oh, it would be fun if we sang a song about nightlights, but then kind of accidentally make it about kind of childish protection and kind of like security blankets and stuff.
I'm smiling because you nailed, I think, what is my mantra, which is fun's more fun when it's serious.
Yeah.
I get crap from my friends and my wife sometimes, but I love to have fun. I think music, anything creative, right? It's all in the spirit of having a good time and letting it flow. But at the same time, if I'm going to endeavor to do something, I tend to take it a little seriously, meaning I pour over it. I think about it. I polish it up. And so, yeah, I agree. I think they're espousing that same premise. And I object. If you go look at the music I've produced, the most recent thing I put out was a heavy metal concept album about Arby's, which is a fast food restaurant here in America. But really, it's just a writing prompt to write music. And the music, the writing of it, the production of it, the execution of it is taken with a sort of deadly seriousness of craft.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, They Might Be Giants definitely influenced me in that way.
But yeah, and I think again, as we're talking, I think we brought up Bare Naked Ladies, who I think are kind of almost kind of contemporaries to the Giants in times. But I think Bare Naked Ladies, I think, have always had a lot more of they flip between serious and profound, particularly.
Sure.
And I think particularly during the Stephen Page era, because I think Stephen Page could go from having a lot more kind of like quirky, if not overtly about the kind of random fun things, more having a kind of left field viewpoint of stuff. Whereas like there's almost the inverse with They Might Be Giants. So yeah, so
totally.
And it's kind of interesting where like we mentioned that it's like I've often saw, and I used to kind of lump those two together, but then they are actually very much opposite ends of the same spectrum when you think about it. But yeah, commercial response, the commercial chart performances and stuff. Again, quite interesting. It was again, Birdhouse in Your Soul. I think he got to number 3 in the Billboard Modern Rock Tracks. He got to 6 in the UK. He got to 12 in Irish. I couldn't find any charting charts things for the US. But the actual Flood, he got to 99 in Australia, got to 14 in the UK, and 75 in the Billboard 200 in the US. So
yeah,
it did better in the UK than the US.
Hey, you guys are always ahead of the curve, you know.
But then again, though, I mean, apart from, I think they are literally one-hit wonders. I think the technically a hit. No, actually, they didn't get. It was 21, so it wasn't actually in the top 20 for "Boss of Me." So yeah, they kind of one-hit wonders, like literal one-hit wonders in the UK. Again, 61 for Istanbul, not Constantinople. I think is strange considering that is probably their better known song in the US. Whereas I think in the I think that Birdhouse in Your Soul is probably going to be remembered by a certain demographic. I think anyone under the age of 30 are going to have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about Birdhouse in Your Soul. They probably might have a better idea of the Malcolm in the Middle theme tune.
Sure.
More than anything. So they'll probably know Boss of Me based on that show more than anything. Kind of like how everyone kind of can't name a single Rembrandt song apart from I'll Be There For You because it was the Friends theme tune.
Of course.
But yeah, so have you ever seen, well, you've mentioned you've met They Won't Be Joined, but have you actually seen them live perform in the...
So yeah, I was holding it for this question, but they're the first concert I ever saw.
Wow, okay. So yeah, when was this? And how old are you?
I believe I was 14 or 15, and it was at a place called the Trocadero in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, near where I grew up. And thankfully, it was an all-ages show, even though it was a bar, and they would have, some non-all-ages shows. So the fact that I could even get in at 14 was pretty cool, because a lot of places weren't like that. Cool. And I probably had to go to the Ticketmaster outlet counter at the local department store, because this was pre-internet. This is like 1995 or something. And it was all, my parents took me to the show. I went with my best friend. We had an awesome time. They dropped us off and we went in and saw the show, and yeah, it was great. And it set in motion a lifetime of concert going. I've now seen probably thousands of concerts. It's been a huge part of my life since then. I'm going to a bunch of concerts this summer, but I consider this the first one.
Wow. So did you see him again since, or
I've seen him a couple times. Yeah, I saw him once probably in the late 90s, maybe when I was in college at a bigger club. And I think I saw him again in San Francisco once. And then, like I said, I went to that small bookstore where they just played a little acoustic set. So that's probably all the times I've actually seen them. I thought about trying to catch them. Unfortunately, I was abroad for most of last year. When they were touring a bunch, I was considering seeing them because they were doing we're going to play the entire Flood album tour. And so sadly, the dates never lined up with where I was.
Shame.
Yeah, but I certainly wouldn't mind seeing them again. I think they had a great, fun live show. They tour with a band. I think it was only shortly after this record came out that they actually started consistently playing with a band. So by the time I saw them, they had a live drummer and other band members, even though the band is still just the two of them. They're kind of a Steely Dan situation, right? It's just those two guys, but then they bring in a lot of studio musicians and touring musicians. But they're a lot of fun, but they also, for better or worse, they feel like part of my childhood, which is now gone. Mm-hmm. And I don't have anyone really to go to the show with these days. That sounds a little sad, but I don't think my wife would be super interested. So we'll have to see if I'm able to catch them again, but I certainly would be open to it.
Okay, but no, glad you've seen them, and yeah, again, as being the first concert as well. I think so they are very much tied into your Genesis of music fandom, more or less.
Absolutely,
so, yeah,
absolutely.
So they're to blame.
Yeah, exactly. I know all these hours spent just poring over the back of albums and reading lyrics and memorizing lyrics and talking with my friends at the bar or on podcasts. Yes.
Yeah, driving to shows, seeing so many bands live. It's their fault.
Yeah,
all the money I wasted on live music. Man, it's never wasted when it is it. So people who listen to Flood and perhaps the first time and want to go on to other albums, where do you recommend that people go to next?
I think if you like Flood, the two albums that are right around this in their catalog are both good options. The one that they released after this is called Apollo 18, and definitely listen to that a bunch back then. Has some great stuff. And the one before it is called Lincoln, which is a reference to the town they grew up in Massachusetts.
Okay.
I think both of those just have all-time They Might Be Giants songs on them. It's kind of more the same. I would say if you go farther back, you're going to get a little less of the production value, but not too much has changed. It's still them with a bunch of it. They play a bunch of instruments themselves. And after Apollo 18, then they started tracking with a live band. So the first one they did with a proper band was John Henry, which I bought and listened to. And I think that's probably what they were touring on when I did see them in 1995. But that's definitely a different sound. It's still them from a songwriting perspective, but they definitely shifted. So I would go Apollo 18 or Lincoln, which are the two albums right around this one.
Okay. Okay, so Apollo 18 and Lincoln. Okay, so now we're here at the very important, most important question of the podcast, which is the song for the Spotify playlist. Now, for anyone who's not listened to this before, what this is, I'm going to ask Rob to pick one song from this album to be immortalised forever onto the Spotify Hall of Fame playlist. I can't veto it. Whatever Rob says goes. So, Rob, which song are you going to pick to be immortalised forever?
Because I think it typifies what I love about They Might Be Giants, and it is such an encapsulated short thing, and I want to expose the world to more weirdness. I'm going with Minimum Wage.
Yeah, which might be the shortest song on the playlist, which makes a change because people have been deliberately picking long songs to pee me off because they know that I'm not a fan of long songs. So
I want you to be listening to this playlist, passively while you're cleaning your house or cooking dinner or in your car, and Minimum Wage comes on and you go, what the heck was that? And before you even have that thought, it's over. And you're like, wait, what's going on right now?
What was that? Was that a Spotify ad? I thought I paid for Spotify. What?
Was that my boss checking in?
So Minimum Wage becomes the latest song to appear onto the playlist, following On the Ropes by The Wonder Stuff and Head Over Feet by Alanis Morissette. So we are now.
Nice.
So we're now at the end of our chat, Rob, and thank you ever so much for reintroducing me into They Might Be Giants. So if people want to find you and your podcast, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find us. Our podcast is called 1001 Album Complaints. You can find us at that Instagram handle, the number 1001 Album Complaints, or at our production company, the kind of parent account, which is called At the Chop Unlimited. And from each of those places, it links out to all the you can find the podcast on all podcast purveyors out there, Spotify, Apple, etc. But also everyone who runs the podcast, which is a show where musicians break down albums week over week and talk about them and review them from a musician's point of view. We're all musicians ourselves. So all the music that we ourselves produce, the heavy metal concept album about Arby's. I also have a Star Trek The Next Generation tribute band called the Beverly Crushers. We like concept albums.
I need to look into that.
Oh, yeah. It's a lot of fun. If you like The Next Generation, you'll love the Beverly Crushers. But anyway, you can find all that stuff at either of those Instagram handles. So check it out. And but I appreciate so much you inviting me on, Matt. It's been an awesome time.
No, thank you so much for coming on. And I need to sit down and listen to the 1001. I've not had a chance to listen to it yet. There's quite a few episodes on you.
Yeah, we're getting in there. Well, you too. We've been going at it for a long time now, learning as we go. Right?
Yeah,
that's the nature of things.
Yeah, I'm very much past the 4.5 years. I'm coming to 5 years in January.
Oh my gosh,
which is ridiculous.
Yeah, it was harder for me to judge that because you don't always number your episodes. Doesn't seem like, but we're 2.5 years in now ourselves. And it's fun. And, the tone is kind of similar. I would say that if you like Pick a Disc and like the rapport of just breaking down an album, we do something kind of similar. We do complain a little more. So it's done with love. It's done with love because I do believe, and I want to make this really clear, that anyone who is putting themselves out there, writing songs, producing music, or attempting to produce good stuff, it's hard. I have the utmost respect for everyone who does that. And as musicians, I've done that. I've tried it. It's quite difficult. That said, it's an inherently silly enterprise to be in the studio, to be in the vocal booth, to try different things, to put different sounds on your record. So we like to laugh about that stuff.
Yeah. I'm definitely going to try and dive in and definitely listen to a few and do a bit of catching up. But and I think with that, we are now definitely at the end of our conversation, Rob. And I just want to say thank you ever so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
You've been listening to Pick a Disc, and I've been your host, Matthew Latham. Our theme music is Pump by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Pick a Disc is hosted by the We Made This podcast network, and you can find them on www.spreaker.com/user/WeMadeThis. You can find the Pick a Disc show site on www.spreaker.com/show/pickadisc. You can find us on all the usual social media type places like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter under Pick a Disc. You can also email us on pickadisc@gmail.com. Until next time, happy listening to all those discs that you are picking. Goodbye.
Hello, and this is Chucky Vision on the We Made This Network, the podcast for all things Chucky. I'm Dev Elson.
And I'm Mark Adams. We're two queer podcasters who love bloody horror,
Camp comedy, gay romance,
and referencing icons like Freddy, Jason, and Britney.
The Chucky films and new TV show deliver all of that, and there is still so much more to cover.
So if you wanna play, find Chucky Vision on Twitter @ChuckyVision and on all good podcast providers.
And yes, the title is a Chuckle Vision pun.
Because why not?